So I have to ask you today, what do you think of when you hear the word hero? We got all kinds of things can come back. If I were to take a poll of your past, your present heroes, who would be on your list? Some might point to maybe some spiritual or religious folks that come to mind. Tim Tebow, Mother Teresa, some individual that really reflects a high theological value. It may be a pro sports person. It may be all different kinds of people. Maybe you want to list a teacher or a professor or a grandparent. Well, the definition of hero is a person who's admired or idealized for remarkable courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. People have, again, many ideas of what a hero is, but the concept of hero was better defined during the tragic attacks our country experienced in 9/11. We began to realize that there's a difference in someone who is good at something and someone who puts their life in jeopardy to save others. And this weekend, our nation honors its heroes. You know, World War I ended at a unique time. It ended exactly at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And on the first anniversary of that day, November 11, 1919, a holiday was set up. Armistice Day, it was called. Congress passed a resolution in 1926 for it to become an annual observance, and November 11 became a national holiday beginning in 1938, several years before World War II. In 1954, President and former World War II General Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a bill changing November 11th from being called Armistice Day to Veterans Day. And in other countries, for instance, Canada, they call it Remembrance Day and the like. And so we're always available on this weekend to remember our vets. It's on this weekend we pay tribute to all our veterans, both living and dead, who fought so bravely to provide and protect our freedoms as a country. You know, there was no U.S. military when the Bible was written, yet Scripture has much to tell us about the people today who we are honoring. Probably the most often quoted verse on such was shown in the video there, and that is John 15:13. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Christ himself was the model of this kind of sacrificial love. When you consider that verse with the next verse, 1 John 3:16, we're familiar with John 3:16, but this is 1 John 3:16. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. So even though Christ was never a soldier in uniform, those who give their life for our country are following in his footsteps and in his example of laying down their lives, if necessary, for their fellow countrymen. But Veterans Day is more than paying tribute to the heroes who ended up dying in our defense. Memorial Day in the spring is set aside to specifically honor those who have passed on. To every man and woman who's ever worn a uniform and stood between us and those who would do our nation harm, today is about honoring and being thankful for all our veterans, past and present. Currently, there are more than 22 million veterans 2 million of which are women, who have served in the United States Armed Forces and have reintegrated back into our society today. If you've ever known anyone who has served in the military, if anyone is online or watching a recording and you've served in the military, we thank you. We are a younger congregation. I tried to poll, and as I did an informal poll here, realized none of us are veterans, but that's okay because we honor those who are. And I would remind you of this. I saw it online recently. It's the veteran, not the preacher, who gave us in this country freedom of religion. It's the veteran, not the reporter, who gave us freedom of the press. It's the veteran, not the poet, who gave us freedom of speech. It's the veteran, not the lawyer, who gave us a right to a fair trial. And it's the veteran, not the politician, who gave us the right to vote. And it's the veteran who salutes the flag and served under the flag, who gave us the freedom to even proudly wave said flag. Also, I want to include our first responders. They are also heroes in that same vein of standing between us and certain calamity. And so anyone who knows a police officer or a firefighter or a paramedic, also a good time to remember them and their service for us. But whoever we think of, whoever is online watching this right now, thinking of it, on behalf of my family, on behalf of our family here at Maranatha Community Church, we say thank you. And we honor you, and we appreciate so much what you and your family have sacrificed. You are true heroes in every sense of the word. You and your families have sacrificed, and we owe each and every one of you a debt of gratitude which we could never personally repay ourselves. You know, one common thread that seems to be woven through the lives of most real heroes, past or present, is that their heroism did not develop overnight. It wasn't like this sudden creation that just popped in on them. Instead, their hero status was almost always achieved after being tested over and over and over again in many small, mundane, trivial, we might say, trials of life. Present heroism usually cannot be explained apart from our past faithfulness when we were under fire. And this was certainly true of many of the Bible characters, but certainly no less that of Daniel. Without question, Daniel should be numbered among one of the greatest and best Bible heroes of all time. In fact, even by today's Hollywood standards, Daniel deserves a hero status. We're going to be looking briefly at Daniel chapter 1 as it introduces Daniel and to us, and looking at some ideas of what heroism is like. First two verses of Daniel 1. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. And verse 6 and 7 tells us the names of some of those individuals. And in fact, you may remember them as Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But one of the trivia questions in our announcement slides were, do you remember their Hebrew names? Well, it says that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. And in Daniel 1, God gives us an inside look at the making of a true hero, what it takes to be a hero today. We're going to look at 3 distinguishing marks of a true hero in any age, back then in Bible times or even today. The first mark of a hero is courage. Verse 8 says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. See, the king had ordered his chief officials to teach the literature and language of the Chaldeans to a select few of the Hebrew prisoners. That would have included mathematics and astronomy, natural history, agriculture, and architecture. They were to eat the king's food and and drink the king's wine. And after 3 years, they were guaranteed a position in the king's personal service. I doubt any of the other exiles were getting along as well as these gentlemen were. And you might be saying to yourself, well, privilege and education, good food, good drink, and a guaranteed sought-after job in the kingdom, who could have a problem with that? Well, Daniel had a problem with that, actually. Daniel didn't argue with the education or the training program or our future position even in the king's court. He didn't even balk when his name was changed to Belteshazzar after a Chaldean god. That didn't bother him. But Daniel drew the line where the scripture did. He wouldn't eat the king's food or drink the king's drink. See, that enticing food and those vintage wines would have been ritually dedicated to Babylon's false gods. Daniel wanted no participation in any pagan feast, even to the slightest degree. That would be a form of idolatry that would provoke the wrath of a jealous God. His decision was ultimately a decision about who he would worship. Daniel resolved to do what was right before God, no matter what the price. He realized that for a child of God, there were certain things that could not be negotiated, certain things that he could not compromise on. So he refused the king's delicacies. And in many ways, Daniel's future usefulness in the kingdom of God depended on this single, seemingly mundane decision in his life. If Daniel had not made this decision, for example, he would never have found himself in the position that he later occupied, nor would he have been faithful enough to cope with them the way he did. Instead, from the very beginning, and what others what might be seen to be a trivial matter, he took a stand. And in doing so, he gained a bridgehead into enemy-occupied territory and found himself increasingly strong in the Lord. There's a practical lesson for all of us in here. We can learn that taking a stand in the little things is usually the biggest test. So we don't want to say things like, well, if terrorists were to come into my home and drag me from the home and threaten to kill me unless I denied my faith, of course I would stand firm. I would never deny Christ. Now, as we dream about taking a strong stand in such a dramatic situation, we often let the little things slide in the meantime. We are less willing to offer our lives in all those little battles for honesty, integrity, and commitment and chastity that rage around us daily. The fact is that many people lapse in the face of a smaller test. Many a husband has walked out on his wife and children because he was no longer committed to the marriage. Many a wife is engaged in an extramarital affair because she wanted more sizzle and romance in her life. Many a young person has become addicted to drugs because he was curious about this euphoric feeling it produced. We need to learn to take a stand in everything, in all the little things in our life today, so that we can be faithful in all the things to come. So then if you should face a large test, you're much more likely to stand through it. You know, we remember 9/11. The week before 9/11, 2001, there was a young man, 32-year-old Todd, and his wife Lisa. They had just gotten back from a romantic getaway to Italy. The couple were both 1991 graduates from Wheaton College. They returned home Monday to rest. They were relieved to be reunited with their boys, David and Andrew, 3 and 1. But the next morning, Todd, an executive with Oracle, had to be at a sales rep meeting in Northern California. He kissed Lisa goodbye, who at the time was 5 months pregnant with their third child, headed to the Newark, New Jersey airport, where he boarded United Flight 93 for San Francisco, California. About 90 minutes into the westbound flight, the Boeing 757 was approaching Cleveland when 3 hijackers on board identified themselves to 34 passengers and the 7 crew and proceeded to take control of the cockpit and of the cabin. The plane, now piloted by the would-be terrorists, made a sharp turn to the south as it reoriented itself. Todd reached for the GTE airphone in the back of the seat and was connected to a GTE supervisor on the ground. He explained to her what was happening and indicated that he and the other passengers probably were not going to survive this. He presumed the pilot and the co-pilot were already seriously injured if they weren't already dead. The GTE employee explained to Todd what had already happened at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Todd told the GTE representative that he and a few others were determined to do whatever they could to disrupt the terrorist plans. He then asked the person on the other end of the phone to call his wife and to report their entire conversation together, and including how much he loved his wife. And before hanging up, this committed Christian and devoted family man who taught Sunday school each and every week asked the GTE employee to pray the Lord's Prayer with him. With the sound of passengers screaming in the background, she went along and complied. When they concluded the prayer, Scott calmly said, "Help me, God, help me, Jesus." The GTE employee then heard Todd say, apparently to the other three businessmen they alluded to earlier, "Are you guys ready? All right, let's roll." With that, the phone went dead. Within a few minutes, Flight 93 was nosediving into a rural field 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, where it left a crater 40 feet deep as it disintegrated upon impact, killing every single human on board. Because Todd Beamer was committed to Jesus Christ and his kingdom, because he was faithful in the little things, he was willing to do whatever was necessary to put the needs of others above his own fear of danger and possible death. Thanks to him and the three other businessmen who joined him, the intended target, the nation's capital, was not reached, and who knows how many lives were saved because of the effort that they took. According to Todd's wife, Lisa, his example of courage has given me and my boys and my unborn baby a reason to live. That's what can happen when we, by the grace of God, learn to obey God in all the little things in our life so that we can obey God in all the larger things in life. The second mark of a hero, though, that we find here of Daniel is humility. If you think of the strength of Daniel's stand, if you think that's really impressive, we'll look even closer now at these next verses to see how he took his stand. Because we can all take a very, I'm not moving, rough kind of stand. Look what he did. Daniel 8, 1 verse 8, I should say. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Notice, Daniel didn't send around leaflets and encourage a riot with all of the other Jews. He didn't begin a protest movement. He didn't try to embarrass his superiors because of his own strong convictions. Instead, he responded to a situation with a spirit of humility and respect by requesting permission of the chief official not to eat the king's food. Daniel patiently explained his situation and his desire to be faithful to his God, and he respectfully asked that he might receive this privilege from him. Daniel learned how to take a strong stand for the Lord in a way that showed the greatness of his God, not in a way that left people staring at Daniel himself, and there is a world of difference in that kind of strength. To take a strong stand for Christ today and to still be humble is a grace that's far too few of us ever attain, but it's a goal, lofty as it is, that we should pursue after. The third mark of a hero, then, is faith. The response of the chief official to Daniel's request to forego the king's food was not really all that too positive. Verse 9, now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you were to become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. But this first rejection didn't cause Daniel to waver, didn't cause him to lose his faith. He remained steadfast in his commitment, as then evidenced in his creative appeal that he gave later. Verse 11, Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating of the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestions and tested them for 10 days. Now it's evident from his request that Daniel sincerely believed that God would honor the strong stand that he had taken. Daniel dared to believe that as he stood for what was truly right, God would supernaturally intervene on his behalf. Although it might not have been God's will to intervene, Daniel still knew that he had a very good reason to believe that God would intervene. And why is that? Because Daniel knew that the issue at stake was God's glory and God's name, and he would follow through. Learning what it means to live for the sake of God's glory will produce in us a spirit of humble faith, that God will act on our behalf as we put him first. It was just this confidence that has always marked the lives of the heroes of faith in both the Old and the New Testament. And it's this kind of confidence in God that continues to mark men and women of faith today. The confidence of true biblical faith is an assurance that is based on what God has promised in his word to do. If you know that God has promised to do something, you have every reason to join with Daniel and have a genuine spirit of confidence and expectancy that he will do so on his behalf and your behalf. Now I ask you to allow me to close this morning with a practical application. You know, in 1 Samuel 2:30, God makes a very special promise. He says, those who honor me, I will honor. You handle your situation right, and God promises to honor that. God's response may not be exactly what you want or exactly when you want it, but his promise still stands. Those who honor me, I will honor. Daniel knew that about his God. And that's why he lived with a spirit of expectancy. And that's why I don't think Daniel was too surprised at what happened next. Verse 15-21, we discover how God honored David's faithfulness. At the end of the 10 days, it says, verse 15, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who'd been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. And when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him quite as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. And David, it says, remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. He was a loyal servant of the king all that time. Now, as I mentioned, the vegetables, I noticed that some of my family members were kibitzing together. I told you, right? For being vegetarian that they are. But the faithful stand that Daniel took was not in vain. God honored his faithfulness, and he will honor your faithfulness and my faithfulness as well. The development of Daniel's character began by learning the importance of honoring God in all the little things in his life. Like what he would do and what he would say and what he would eat according to obey God's laws. And Daniel soon learned that these smaller battles were actually God's training ground to prepare him for much more major conflicts that were coming. You may not understand, you may not relate to this name or know what it's about, but Philip P. Bliss is a gentleman who wrote a children's song titled Dare to be a Daniel. Some of you may know that song. Perhaps you didn't know that the song was written by a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. See, Philip Bliss was born in a log cabin. At the age of 11, he left home and he lived a rough life in a logging camp for several years. When Christ finally saved him, he decided he would leave that wild lifestyle. He soon got married, and he went on the road as a teacher of music. He went from place to place, teaching churches and children music for the glory of God. He committed his life to honor and obey God in all the little things of life. And that was put to test many times in his life. On the last day of his life, he was tested yet once again. It was December 29, 1876. He was only 38 years old. He had become famous by that time. He was on his way to Moody Tabernacle to lead the singing at a great crusade for Dwight L. Moody. The train in which he and his wife were riding crumbled as the bridge that carried it crumbled beneath him. He escaped, but soon realized that his wife was still inside that train. He knew that his life would be in danger if he went back in, but that didn't stop him. He crawled back in the cabin and found his wife. Unfortunately, while he was in there, it caught fire, and he died arm in arm with his wife. You know, the refrain to his simple song went like this: dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose, dare to make it known. Philip Bliss, like Daniel before him, learned the importance of honoring God in the little things in his life. I say today, may God bless the heroes that are with us today, who dared to have a purpose and to make it known. May God help you and me to obey him in all the little things that come to test us along the way, so that we may grow in courage and humility and faith. And so I ask you to join me in prayer today as we close.